In 1949, with the establishment of modern-day China, its leader, Chairman Mao, declared that to oppose imperialist aggression, we must build a powerful navy. But was this ever a realistic ambition? When the Chinese Civil War ended in 1949, the Communist forces proved victorious. The then small Chinese Navy seemed at first very content staying just a minor coastal defense force. Though in the 1950s they did upgrade these forces by adopting some simple and very basic Soviet Navy ships and technology. But after the Chinese and Soviet Union fell out in 1960, the Chinese spent most of that decade and the 1970s on developing their own arms manufacturing industry. This involved developing several major shipbuilding yards. The ships they ended up producing were not particularly advanced and were mostly unsophisticated copies of slight improvements on much older Soviet designs. Going forward into the 1990s, the Chinese Air Force and Army seemed to take priority. But even then, the Chinese military could not seem to shake their obsession with weight of numbers rather than improve the quality of their equipment. During this period, the Chinese Navy only really seemed to have two real objectives. The first was to defend the motherland from any possible sea invasion, as there was no realistic chance of this actually happening anytime soon. Therefore, the Chinese Navy was seen to be just a token deterrent, rather than a particularly effective force to be reckoned with. The second was to contain the nearby breakaway Republic of Taiwan, the aim of one day supporting the Chinese Army invasion of the island. 30 years on, the aspiration has yet to be realized by China. For Taiwan, also known as the Republic of China, and formerly was the Chinese island province of Formosa, had in 1949 become the last refuge of the then defeated nationalist forces. They had then set up their own government there, which the mainline Chinese government refused to recognize. Instead, they had followed ever since a policy of there being only one China, and vowed one day to liberate it and return it to their control, by force, if necessary. China has since the 1950s made up for its distinct lack of an effective ocean-going fleet by investing heavily in land-based anti-ship gun batteries and concentrating on developing missile defense systems. This would eventually lead to the HY-2 Silkworm missile, which is a very early type of anti-ship cruise missile. It would take nearly 20 years to fully develop the Silkworm, and finally it would enter service at the end of the 1960s, and is in still service today. And these missiles' abilities were enhanced even further when whole squadrons of H-6D heavy bombers were modified to each carry a pair of them. The H-6D was based on the Russian 1950s Tu-16 Badger heavy jet bomber, and with a range in excess of 3,700 miles. It meant, for the very first time, the Chinese Navy had a truly effective strategic naval strike capability. So now the Chinese Navy would attack a heavily defended U.S. task force and potentially sink its centerpiece, its aircraft carrier. These aircrafts and its missiles became the cornerstone of the Chinese Navy's regional power and projection for the next few decades, as the Chinese strived to become the dominant naval power in the region. By the 2000s, the Chinese government started to have ambitions to control the South China Seas and to become the leading naval force in the Southeast Pacific area. They even went as far as to start developing cutting-edge hypersonic anti-ship missiles in the form of the DF-ZF, which would later be given the nickname Carrier Killers. They started to introduce these into service in 2019, primarily as a coastal self-defense system. Soon, the Chinese Navy got even more ambitious and introduced in 1983 its very first ballistic submarine, the Type 092 NATO, reporting name the Kuznetsov-class. But what it felt it really lacked, which few countries possess, and that would set the Chinese Navy apart from most other nations, and that was possessing an aircraft carrier. China, since the early 1970s, had the long-term ambition of building and operating aircraft carriers of its own, but was hampered by having absolutely no experience in this field. But then, in 1985, the Chinese Navy intelligence got to examine in detail the ex-HMAS Melbourne, a former Australian 1940s light fleet aircraft carrier that had been sent nearly fully intact to China to be scrapped. Once there, the Chinese obviously took their time in scrapping it, while they gleaned as much information as possible from the ship that they possibly could. Bizarrely, it never occurred to Australia that Chinese might do this, and seemingly were completely oblivious to the valuable secrets they had so freely given away to the Chinese. After their highly secretive examination of the Melbourne, it depressingly convinced the Chinese Navy that they still had a lot to learn before they could attempt to build and operate a carrier of their very own. So in the late 1990s, rather oddly, the Chinese decided instead to purchase two ex-Russian Kiev-class heavy aircraft cruisers. These ships are basically heavy cruisers with a limited, straight flight deck attached to the side for operating helicopters or vertical takeoff and landing aircraft from. As China had no VTOL aircraft and had never shown any interest in developing or buying these types of aircraft themselves, it seemed the Chinese buying these 30,000-ton heavy aircraft cruisers was a very strange thing to do. At the time, there were many rumors and theories that they were all part of some highly covert and elaborate top-secret Chinese aircraft carrier program. In the end, the Kiev was constructed in 2011 to a luxury hotel and placed in a Chinese theme park. As for her sister ship, the Minsk, from 2000 to 2016 it became a Chinese theme park attraction. Then it was sold to a Chinese military museum. The Chinese had in the 1990s looked into purchasing an actual fully working aircraft carrier, but instead they became interested in the Varyag, a partially completed Russian aircraft carrier which the Ukraine had inherited in 1991 after the collapse of the Soviet Union. It lay in a Ukrainian port, rusting away for years until 1998, whereupon it was sold to China under the false cover story that was going to be converted into a floating casino. Meanwhile, 40 tons of the carrier's blueprints were then secretly shipped overland to China in 8 unmarked trucks. Then in 2000, the Varyag finally set off to China. Incredibly, this global journey took nearly 2 years. The reason for this was initially it got only as far as Turkey, where the ship got embroiled in a financial dispute that held it up there for months. Then after it proceeded on its journey, it was nearly wrecked in a violent storm off the coast of Greece. Later, it was denied passage through the Suez Canal and therefore had to take the long route around Africa to the Indian Ocean. Finally, by March 2002, after traveling 17,500 miles, the Varyag arrived in China. Then after an extensive refit that lasted a decade, it finally entered Chinese military service in 2012 as the training carrier, the Yanning. But despite this, it still did not become fully operational until around 2016. Therefore, it had taken nearly 20 years after the Chinese first purchased the carrier before it had at last become operational. It's now helping create the foundations of a future Chinese naval air arm. In 2021, a spy satellite picture revealed that the Chinese had made full-scale mock-ups in the desert of the latest U.S. aircraft carriers for highly realistic target practice, showing China's commitment to both challenge and take on the U.S. mighty carriers. And though China and Russia these days only have informal agreements to cooperate diplomatically and politically, driven no doubt for their own self-interest, China might well need in the near future Russian support if it's ever to fulfill its ambition of retaking the province of Taiwan. Whereas the Russians, who had obviously underestimated the intensity of the Ukrainian resistance to Russian invasion of their homeland, now find itself after a lengthy and prolonged conflict in desperate need of restocking and expanding its military capability. So at the start of 2023, high-ranking Russian politicians put forward the surprising suggestion to help restore the much-dented nation's pride and buy back their former aircraft carrier from the Chinese and make it the new flagship of their Black Sea fleet. This is unlikely to happen, as the Chinese, whose original aim was the carrier was for it to be just a training carrier, has just recently changed its status to being an operational carrier and has now started to deploy it overseas in what many see as an intimidating fashion. And on the 17th of June 2022, the Chinese launched its own first purpose-built carrier, the Type 003 Fujin. This is now in the stage of being fitted out and being prepared for sea trials. Estimates put it at about 984 feet long and weighing around 90,000 tons, which put it in the same league as the U.S. supercarriers. It thought that its air group would consist of 40 advanced fighter aircraft, along with dozens of propeller-powered transporters, anti-submarine warfare, and airborne early warning and control aircraft. The West and its allies' response in the region has been slow and made up mostly of symbolic diplomatic gestures. But of greater significance is on September 15, 2021, the leaders of Australia, the UK, and the US announced AUKUS. This is a new security partnership in the Indo-Pacific region and commits that 3 nations share intelligence, deepen cooperation between them, and help Australia build nuclear-powered submarines, all with the aim to counter China's influence in the region. Though this is all very much a long-term strategy, and has already upset an important ally of theirs, as it meant a very short notice the Australians cancelling a multi-billion submarine contract with the French. Overall, the members of AUKUS here and now response to the Chinese threat has been half-hearted to say the least. The Australians are still stuck in the part of their long-term defense cycle where they have to update and modernize their armed forces. Among the many equipment challenges the Australian Defence Force is facing are awaiting delivery of their new upgraded M1A2 Abrams main battle tanks. They are also still in the process of replacing thousands of Land Rover Parentis, which are nearing 40 years of military service with the Australian Defence Forces. And the Australians are still relying on an increasingly outdated equipment, like the Airbus Tiger attack helicopter that has already been in service for 20 years, and whose pilots at one stage all voted not to fly them, as they felt it to be so unsafe. The Australian Army has been in the process of replacing its 1980s-era main infantry weapon, the F-88 Austur assault rifle, but this process has started in 2016 is not even half completed. Their naval forces are also in much need of a serious revamp. A large-scale program is currently underway to replace its fleet of offshore patrol vessels, as well as replacing its main force of combat frigates. And there's also a desperate need to replace their entire fleet of attack submarines, which are based on a design that is over 30 years old. Each one had cost nearly $1 billion. Despite over the years several major refits, modifications, and upgrades, they're rapidly approaching the end of their useful service life. As for the British Royal Navy's long-term deployment in the region is limited to just 2 River-class patrol vessels, the HMS Spey and the HMS Tamar. These are both lightly armored and are mostly involved in humanitarian missions, like the 2022 school building program on the island nation of Tonga. As for the U.S. Navy in the Pacific, it has been recently suffering increasingly from maintenance issues, accidents, and personnel burnout. An official U.S. report has cited the reason for all this is being that the Navy is overstretched in the region. The situation is going to get worse before it gets better. In August 2022, the U.S. government allowed its then Speaker of the House of Representatives, 82-year-old Nancy Pelosi, to visit Taiwan, much to the annoyance of the Chinese government. Then in January 2023, the U.S. Navy defiantly sailed a warship through the Straits of Taiwan. The U.S. government said that this showed their commitment to a free and open Indo-Pacific. None of these actions seem to have done little more than irritate the Chinese. So one must ask oneself that 70 years on, has Chairman Mao's ambition to oppose imperialist aggression, we must build a powerful navy, finally starting to come true.